Thank you for joining me for another video. This talk today is on the use of DDGS and corn fermented protein in aquafeeds. This was a talk that was commissioned by the United States Grains Council, and I've been traveling around Southeast Asia presenting this talk to various feed companies. So here we go. Okay, use of DDGS and corn fermented protein in aquafeeds 2025. So let's start out by explaining, first of all, what we mean when we're talking about these feed ingredients. Distillers dried grains with solubles, so this is where DDGS comes from. And there is an old generation DDGS that comes from whiskey alcohol production, and this was very common up until the early 2000s. It was really the only product that was available. And then we had an equivalent product when it was made from beer called Brewer's Dried Grains. However, in the early 2000s, in 2001 to be exact, the United States government mandated that a certain amount of U.S. corn had to be used to produce ethanol for mixing in car fuel. And so then they had this new generation DDGS, and they started marketing it internationally for use in feeds. Now, what is CFP? So the American Association of Feed Control Officials, or AFCO, defines CFP as corn fermented protein mechanically separated, and the crude protein content is greater than or equal to 48%. So all CFP production steps up to alcohol extraction are the same as in the DDGS process. But after the alcohol extraction, while the material is still wet, a series of mechanical stages, including separations, centrifuging, washing, to concentrate the protein particles and the yeast cells, and then this is flash dried to produce CFP. Now, in the early days when this high protein product was being made, there were some different methods, and there were some different technologies being used. And another one, not CFP, is called HPDDG, or high protein DDG. And in this case, it's the same category as DDGS because after alcohol extraction, additional solid-state fermentation with carbohydrase enzymes, for example, xylenases, mannanases, glucanases, reduces the fiber content, and this increases the protein percentage. And for these products, the crude protein content is in the range of 36 to 48%. So starting at about 10% higher than DDGS, but below the protein level of CFP. So how are DDGS and CFP made? So let's compare them, the processes, and then we'll talk about corn gluten meal, which is a product we're all very familiar with, and also corn protein concentrate, which is another even higher protein product that's been in the market for a while. Looking here on the left-hand side, we have corn dry milling process, and as opposed to corn wet milling process. Let's look at the corn wet milling process first. So we start with our corn, we clean it, we steep it, or in other words, we soften it, and then we're going to use that then to uh, do some milling in this stage, but it's a wet process. And then we separate out the wheat germ, and then we have the grinding at this stage. So it's wet, and then some of the fiber is extracted. We have the starch gluten slurry. We in this stage we're going to be removing the starch, converting it into sugar, and then after we convert it into sugar, uh, we're going to then use that to produce corn fructose syrup, or in other words, high fructose corn syrup. We have then leftover product is the gluten, and this is where corn gluten meal comes from. Now, if we take that corn gluten meal and we do further processing on it, we then end up with corn protein concentrate, as you see here. On the other hand, going back to the dry milling process, what we're doing here is we're doing an alcohol extraction. So the product is fermented with yeast. The yeast converts the starch into alcohol. The alcohol is extracted out, and then what we end up with is the wet product after alcohol has been extracted. If we take that product and we don't do anything else with it, and we then evaporate it and we dry it, we end up with Distiller's dried grains with solubles right here. Now, if at this stage, after the alcohol has been removed and the product has been centrifuged, we then put in these extra mechanical steps, and my next slide will show you some of that process, then this is where the corn fermented protein comes from. This is a description. This is actually coming from the Fluid Quip uh, patent drawings for the process. This QR code, you can go and actually download the paper from free patents online, and you'll see it here. So we have the normal corn ethanol extraction process, and at this point where we have distillation and dehydration, we then go and put it through this mechanical process where we have screens, we have filtration, centrifuge, we have washing and pressure screens, washing with water here. We then evaporate out the water. So basically what we're doing here is we are extracting out the water-soluble protein and also the remainder of the yeast from the yeast fermentation process. Uh, and then we end up with then a very high protein product, which has the liquefied but now dehydrated corn protein and also the yeast cells. As you can see here, we end up with a high protein cornmeal. So that's the basic process. This is why AFCO is talking about a mechanically extracted process. If we look at the new generation corn DDGS, this coming from ethanol production versus old generation DDGS coming from whiskey production, we see some slight differences here in the amino acid profile, indicating that the protein is a little bit more concentrated. And here you have this is coming from this paper by Schersen et al. In 2003. If we compare new generation corn DDGS, which is in the first column here, with several other feed ingredients, corn gluten feed, this is not something we typically use in aquaculture. Corn gym meal, we don't use that in aquaculture. The two we in the past would use this brewer's dried grains, and then everybody is familiar then with the corn gluten meal. And so the corn gluten meal, normally protein is above 60, whereas new generation DDGS is typically around 28 or so. So this is giving us the fat content, some of the fiber components, some energy components, but these are not for aquatic animals, amino acids, and then down here, minerals. So we have calcium and phosphorus and available phosphorus. I will come back and talk about this a little bit later. As a result of the fermentation and ethanol extraction process in DDGS, the available phosphorus relative to total phosphorus content is actually quite high compared with other corn ingredients. So notice here that the new generation, the phosphorus percent is 0.7% total phosphorus, and available is 0.71, so very, very high, above 80%. Where if we compare with other, we have corn gluten meal, for example, total phosphorus is 0.44, but available is only 0.07. And this is because the process of producing the ethanol extracted DDGS actually breaks down some of the phytic acid, releasing that phosphorus and making it available, whereas with other corn products, this does not occur. This is a paper by Kerr from 2015 looking at the composition of corn DDGS, 6 different samples, although the sources are not identified. We then have lysine, which of course we're interested in. And then we have some starch components, fiber components, mineral components. We have a fatty acid profile, more or less. And then, interestingly enough, they have also bothered to check the mycotoxin content. And many of the mycotoxins, such as the aflatoxins, have not been detected. Ochratoxin in not detected, T2 toxin not detected, but zearalenone found in some samples and not in others. The main ones we find in corn products are deoxyvalenol and some of the fumonisins. This is some relatively recent data. This is coming from Poet LLC. The mean composition of more than 200 samples of DDGS from 30 different Poet ethanol biorefineries in 2025. So quite new data. So we see here the not only the mean value for the nutrient, but we also see the CV values. And the CV values are under 5%. This is really excellent. If for agricultural byproducts, we get a CV under 10. That is very, very good. For the amino acid profiles, then there's some values here, but we're typically ranging from about 4.5 up to about 8. The variability here is mostly going to come from the variability of the corn coming from the farm. So the farm is going to have a much bigger impact than processing. We also then have some mineral profiles, and the phosphorus here, the CV is 9.9 under 10. And mycotoxins, we see that some of the mean values are quite low, except we see that some of them have quite a high CV, meaning that there's a lot of variability. Some samples could be very low, some samples might be on the high side. We don't normally think a lot about the fatty acids in the DDGS, but DDGS does provide a certain amount of linoleic acid, or LA, and alpha linolenic acid, or alpha LNA. And this is from a paper Here you can see this was samples of DDGS that were imported into Saudi Arabia from America. You can scan the QR code there. So here we are looking at the linoleic acid, typically 49%, 50% or so, maximum for 51.6, minimum about 48. So the linoleic acid content is quite high, although the fat content of the DDGS itself is relatively low. And then we do have a small amount of linolenic acid as well. Another area of interest when we're talking about corn oil is the corn oil contains a fair amount of tocopherol or vitamin E. And so here we have corn germ. Here, this is where corn oil is extracted. And then we have DDGS here on the right-hand side. The alpha tocopherol is the bioactive form of vitamin E. The other tocopherols, gamma delta, they do not have any vitamin E activity. And then we also have tocotrienols. Now, tocotrienols do not have any vitamin E activity, but they are excellent antioxidants. And their ability to uh, be antioxidants is 40 to 60% times more potent than even the well-known alpha tocopherol. Okay, moving on to corn fermented protein. These are samples coming from one factory. So Poet has one factory in Shell Rock, Iowa. And these were samples collected in 2024, but the number of samples is relatively low. This is only coming from one factory, whereas the previous data was coming from more than 30 different factories. Here we have protein, fat, and fiber, amino acids, minerals, and mycotoxins once again. And the CV values are all quite okay. Among these, the ash content is the highest. And once again, the phosphorus is about 9.9%. But like I said, a lot of this variability is coming from the origin of the corn and the farming procedures and so on, rather than from the processing in the ethanol factory. Now, this is coming from a paper by Verbeek in 2024. You can scan it and download it there. And what she has done here is she is comparing two products from the Andersons, which is one of the better known producers of DDG and HP, DDG and CFP in the United States. Protein content, this is where we begin to see the difference. For the HP DDG, as I mentioned, the protein is under 48%, and the CFP is higher than 48%. So here we have 55.5% protein, and we have amino acid profile. So let's talk about some of the other characteristics of corn products. Let's talk about carotenoids. So the carotenoids in corn germ and DDGS in this paper by Winkler Moser and Breyer from 2011. We have then on the left-hand side, I don't have the heading here, but this is for corn germ. And then on this side, we have for DDGS. So total carotenoids are around 75 micrograms per gram, or about 75 ppm. And mainly lutein, but also a fair amount of zeaxanthin and a very small amount of beta carotene. This is some data from Green Plains Inc., one of the main CFP producers in America, and showing then the xanthophyll and carotene content in several high protein corn products. So we have lutein, zeaxanthin, beta-carotenes of different forms, and the cryptoxanthins. So we have corn fermented protein 50%. This product from Green Plains called Sequence, which is a corn fermented protein 60%. They're comparing it here with corn gluten meal and then also corn protein concentrate. And this is the Cargill product called Imperial 75. And looking at the total carotenoids, uh, corn gluten meal is typically 300 to say 350, but the corn protein concentrate is well over 400. And compare that at a much lower level of around 60 to 70 total carotenoids in the corn fermented protein. So this means that the higher levels can be used without a lot of pigmentation going to fish, some species of which we don't really want to have color in the skin or in the meat. Now, when we feed plant carotenoids, uh, most of the color that we see in crustaceans and in some marine fish is coming from astaxanthin. And different groups of animals have different abilities. So crustaceans can convert some plant carotenoids, zeaxanthin, lutein, and quercetin, into astaxanthin. And many freshwater fish, mainly herbivorous carps, but a few others, can utilize zeaxanthin and lutein, but not quercetin or beta-carotene to synthesize astaxanthin, which is, for example, fancy carp are the best example, very bright red color. And in the case of most marine red fish species, red fish comes only from astaxanthin. Now we can feed them these plant carotenoids that contain zeaxanthin, lutein, quercetin, and so on, but they cannot be converted to astaxanthin. They can be deposited in the flesh and they will be measured, but they will not change the color of the flesh. And the red color in the skin will come only from astaxanthin. Now, whenever we talk about corn, we need to talk about mycotoxin risk. Now, the thing is that mycotoxins are always a potential risk. So that does not mean that all corn products contain all the mycotoxins. In a season where you have harvesting going on and the weather conditions are excellent, weather is dry, the risk becomes very, very low. However, when we have poor weather conditions and we have transportation and storage as well, we might have rainier fall than usual, we might have a risk. Now, the FDA and the USDA monitor harvests closely, and they put out announcements whenever they find a certain part of a region in a certain state in America. They will notify the entire market that mycotoxin levels are in excess in certain areas. Now, corn ethanol producers, they also monitor their incoming raw materials because after a while they realize that these byproducts have to be fed to animals. And so therefore, for animals, mycotoxins are in fact a risk. Now, the FDA set these action levels in 2000, and they have action levels only for aflatoxins, deoxyvalenol, and fumonisin, but not for zearalenone and T2 toxin. So the corn ethanol producers will monitor all of these, but for the first three, when there is an FDA action level, whenever samples of these agricultural products have been found at levels above those, these products are in fact not allowed to be sold or distributed, and they will be um, uh, destroyed in some way or another. Now notice that the action levels are quite high relative to the LOD on the far right, which is the limit of detection. Over here in Asia, we're often quite concerned about, well, if we buy American DDGS, and it's going to be transported from a processing plant to a port, from a port across the ocean, in either in bulk or in containers, which could take weeks to a month or more. And then the product comes over here to Asia. Is there risk of mycotoxin or not? So this was a paper published by Coppert in 2008, Scientific Overview of the Presence and Levels of Mycotoxins in US DDGS. So what did they do here? Well, they went to the ethanol plant, and in this case, they had 7 plants, and they collected samples of the DDGS, and they found the minimum level of these different mycotoxins, maximum levels, and averages. And then they note the percent that were above the lowest FDA action levels. So those 7 plants then loaded DDGS into containers, and then those 11 of those containers were measured at the U.S. port before leaving the United States. So once again, we see minimum levels detected, maximum levels detected, the average in all samples. So basically, they really only found fumonisin. And the percent that were above the FDA action levels, there were none. Now, these were then shipped by container to Taiwan. And so that may be some coming from the US East Coast. It's going to have to travel for some period of time, several weeks at a minimum. And those same containers were then tested on arrival in Taiwan. And once again, the percentage above the lowest level of FDA action levels was none. So the thing is, what they're basically showing us here is that this process of transporting from the DDGS producer to a port, from the port to Asia, there is no increase in risk of DDGS and presumably other corn products having increasing levels of mycotoxins. Okay, DDGS and CFP in fish feeds. Let's talk about some scientific results that have been determined. So first of all, here in tilapia, we have papers starting from 2016, going up to 2023. And the conclusion is that inclusion rates of DDGS in tilapia could be 20 to 30% without supplemental lysine and or methionine. But if we supplement with lysine and methionine, both of which are a little bit low in DDGS, then we could potentially go up to 50%. And CFP inclusion could be 20 to 25%. This could essentially be a fish meal-free diet. Protein levels for tilapia are typically in the high 20s to maybe mid 30% protein level. And so in a feed like this, some CFP can be included. Moving on to catfish. So here we have type of catfish. So we have CC stands for channel catfish. HB is hybrid catfish, and PG is pangasius. So we have mostly channel catfish here, but we do have some hybrids, and we have a couple of results from pangasius. The inclusion levels that were tested up to 40%, 30%, 30%, 15%, 40%, and so on. And we see the levels that were recommended by these authors. So for DDGS, 15 to 30% may require supplementation with lysine and methionine. And for CFP inclusion, 10 to 20% without supplemental lysine and or methionine, but up to 40% is possible with supplemental lysine. For carp, DDGS inclusion could be up to 40% with supplemental lysine and or methionine. And for corn fermented protein, actually if we think about a little bit, these feeds are typically low protein formulas. They typically can utilize feed ingredients with low to mid-level protein. CFP is really above the level of common ingredients in carp feeds. We do have the issue with low cost. In most cases, carp feeds are very low cost, and CFP is simply too expensive. Nevertheless, we have some research starting here in 2019, going up to 2023. And you can look at those results. I am not giving you these papers, but if you search in these references by those names and looking for either DDGS or CFP, depending on what the table is showing you here, you can probably find those, especially if you're using a software program or using like Google Scholar. This is a paper relatively recent from April this year on corn fermented protein to replace fish meal in diets for Atlantic salmon. And here we see the FCR, and at about the 25% inclusion level of corn fermented protein was the optimal lowest FCR for Atlantic salmon. And in the case of the protein efficiency ratio, it was around 18.6. So here we could say that we would want to maybe include somewhere around, let's say 18 to 25% would be the sweet spot for including corn fermented protein to replace some level of fish meal in feeds for Atlantic salmon. European sea bass. So this is the Dicentrarchus labrax. I also consider we can use this as a proxy for Asian sea bass or Lattice calcarifer. Once again, you can look over here. I've got papers showing you here from 2015 up to 2025. And the DDGS inclusion, actually DDGS is not really recommended for marine fish because it has protein levels that are too low in feeds that are typically protein 45 to 55% protein. And it also has a little bit high fiber. So, and we also sometimes will face some problems with extrusion. That is, when we use DDGS, it causes feeds to float and um, or may cause problems certainly with bulk density. And in CFP inclusion, in a low fish meal feed, 10 to 20% without supplemental lysine and or methionine. But if we use lysine and methionine, we may be able to increase it maybe another 5 to 10% above that level. Talk now about shrimp feeds. So this is DDGS only, papers from 2015 to 2024. The Rhodes paper is based on a PhD that was done at Auburn University. It's a little bit, some of the results are looking a little bit strange here, but nevertheless, I've included it. You can go and find that paper and read it for yourself, decide how much faith you want to put into it. In the case of DDGS, 10 to 20% inclusion with supplemental lysine and methionine. Now, looking at use of the higher protein products, we've got corn fermented protein in this table, we've got HP DDG, and we have CFPC. So CFPC is corn fermented protein concentrate. This is a product from Cargill. In this case, the product is being marketed as Motive. Recommended levels up to 30% without supplemental lysine and or methionine. And if we add more methionine, we can maybe go up to 40%. We could basically replace, as suggested here in this paper, to replace 100% of fish meal. Now, this is some information from poetfeedresearch.com, and Poet replaced a combination of fish meal and soybean meal, and this you see here the level of Poet CFP in the feed formula up to 24%, and the best weight gain actually occurred at only 6% inclusion, but at the higher level we're basically not much different than the weight gain of the control. We're actually better than the control here. Looking at the cost savings in ton of feed, of course, if we take the fish meal out, and often CFP is quite a competitive price relative to high protein soybean meal. We can add more, we can get some considerable cost savings on the cost of our feed. Quickly moving on to some digestibility studies. This is a paper from Welker. He works for the USDA in America. And they tested DDGS alone with Nile tilapia, and then they also tested what they're calling DDGS plus, and this was with feeds in which phytase and xylanase were spray coated on these extruded feeds. We're just covering the basics here. When we have crude protein, we see an increase when we spray the enzymes of around nearly 2%. Fat increase about 1%. Digestible energy, we see about 3%. Ash is quite high, actually, about 10%. And phosphorus is quite high as well. Now, where's that coming from? Well, if we understand that the available phosphorus in DDGS is quite high already, then the main benefit of using the enzymes here may in fact be coming from the xylanase breaking down the non-starch polysaccharides rather than the phytase. But this work doesn't go into a lot of discussion about which one of these enzymes would have been the major factor in releasing that extra phosphorus. This is a paper by Yamamoto from 2024 looking at channel catfish. In this case, comparing corn fermented protein and soybean meal. So protein, the soybean meal is slightly higher. Lipid, the corn fermented protein is higher. Phosphorus, the corn fermented protein is considerably higher. And once again, that's because this is a product that's coming from DDGS where the available phosphorus is already quite high. Rainbow trout. And this is a paper by Wendy Seeley, just come out very recently. And looking at corn fermented protein and high protein distillers dried grains, or HPDDG. In this case, they're looking at a couple of products from the Andersons, the Advantage 40 and 50. So this 40, if you look at the protein level here, this is not giving us the protein content of these products. Actually, it's giving us the digestibility of the protein. So 81%, 82%, 83% protein digestibility, energy digestibility above 70, and the fat in these two products is actually very high. And then we have the amino acid digestibilities of these two CFP products. European sea bass. This is a relatively recent paper, once again, 2024 by Martins and colleagues, testing specifically the Poet corn fermented protein. And we have the apparent digestibility coefficients compared with a controlled diet. And we see here soybean meal, and then we also have the CFP. So in terms of dry matter digestibility and protein digestibility, and the POET CFP is slightly better. In terms of the protein, it's about 8-9% better. And in terms of the energy digestibility, it's basically more or less about the same. Briefly talking about extrusion, because there have been concerns expressed in the past about some of the issues with extrusion of DDGS limiting the inclusion rates of DDGS in fish feed formulas. Here we have a number of published results from people testing with single screw extruders. Mostly this work was done in 2008, 2009. We've got papers by Chevanan, we've got papers by Kanad Hassan and Rosentrader. And over here you see the main composition of the diets, the binders that were added, the percent of DDGS basically ranging from about 20 to 40%. We have the bulk density of the products. In most cases, these are high, indicating these are sinking feeds. And then we have the pellet durability index. So this is an indication of how well these feeds can survive being broken or creating dust during handling. This page is all you considering with twin screw extrusion, the more or less the same authors. DDGS inclusion levels 20, 40, and 60%, quite high, up to 50% here. And this author at these lower levels, 24.34, 0.24, these are actually floating. Going then to 60% inclusion of DDGS produces a sinking pellet. And most of these other authors were making sinking pellets. And the pellet durability index here was quite good. Let's talk about SWOT analysis. So strengths, more than 32 million tons are produced in the United States alone. Millions of tons, 10 to 15 million metric tons are exported around the world. The xanthophylls in DDGS are good for pigmentation of tilapia and shrimp. Weaknesses, the protein is low in lysine but high in methionine. And low methionine is a typical problem with plant proteins across the board. Often amino acid supplementation is required if DDGS is used at higher levels. We have a relatively high fiber content. Now, DDGS can be used with small pangasius, but when we start talking about pre-harvest fish, then the producers are concerned that the xanthophyll content will make the fish flesh yellow, which they do not want. And the way to get around that is to formulate and assess the xanthophyll content of the feed formulation. As long as you keep the feed xanthophyll total below about 11 ppm, then the flesh will not pigment. Moving on to opportunities. Using DDGS with feed enzymes, particularly carbohydrase enzymes and proteases, makes DDGS usable in more feeds than before. Threats. Well, we do know that there's a potential risk of mycotoxins, and that risk can partly be mitigated through the use of mycotoxin binders, which are a common feed additive available in most countries. Moving on to the SWOT for CFP strengths, a high quality corn protein at a cheaper price point than corn gluten meal or corn protein concentrate. The high methionine content is complementary to the low methionine content of soy. So blending corn protein and soybean meal is a very good way to balance these amino acids without resorting to the use of supplemental amino acids. Weakness. Well, corn fermented protein is quite new in the export market. Now, it started being exported in 2012, but not so many people seem to be really aware of it, and not much aquaculture feed research has been done. If you notice in my talk, most of the research with CFP or HP DDG has only been done since about 2020, 2021, 2022. Many of the papers are very new, 2023 up to 2025. As we progress further into the future, then more research will come out and maybe we'll begin to understand if, using CFP actually does have any real weaknesses. Opportunities: the high protein and low fiber content makes CFP a viable source of protein in feeds for carnivorous fish and in shrimp. Threats: the use in aquaculture is new and we don't really know about threats at this point. I do have some questions about the mechanical washing steps. Do they reduce mycotoxin content? Now, looking at some papers that are talking about the washing and processing that's going on in DDGS production, some of the mycotoxins seem to be retained in the solids, and some mycotoxins seem to come out with the liquid fraction. So we do know from early on when I was showing you the data that there are some mycotoxins there, but we do need to have more research on this. So to summarize, DDGS and CFP co-products are produced in large quantities and almost exclusively from the United States, and they are exported all around the globe. DDGS is suitable for use in most feeds for herbivorous and omnivorous species, that is, feeds with protein levels below, say, 35%. But when we start to deal with protein levels above 40%, 45%, the protein level of DDGS is a little bit too low and the fiber content is a bit too high. The amino acid digestibility of DDGS and CFP and corn fermented protein have been shown to be high when tested with both fish and shrimp. So that is actually a good thing. We don't actually need protein, we need digestible amino acids. And looking specifically at carnivorous species, whether we're talking about salmon, trout, sea bass, grouper, or maybe some freshwater carnivores, CFP provides a high quality protein at an affordable price without the high fiber. Finishing off here, recommended maximum inclusion rates for DDGS. This is coming from the US Grains Council DDGS user handbook. Recommended levels for the different species, as you can see here. And for inclusion of corn fermented protein, we don't really have any information yet. Now, this is from research done by Greens Plains, and this was an undated marketing document prepared by two authors, Craig and Renz. And the authors recommended the following levels. So we see CFP 50 and sequence, which is CFP 60. We have rainbow trout, channel catfish, tilapia, Atlantic salmon, and marine shrimp. Now, they do include barramundi. And that's because there were in the United States, fairly close to a CFP factory, there were some recirculating indoor systems where American farmers had decided that they wanted to grow fish indoors instead of growing pigs, and they were actually growing barramundi in recirculating systems, and the feed was being made by Green Plains, so that's why they're recommending here 14 to 18%. But there is no research that's done, for example, in barramundi cage culture in ponds or in cages in outdoors. So that's something that we do need to see. That's the end of my presentation, and I want to let you know that not only am I here on YouTube, but I'm also on X, and I can be found there at Fish Nutrition Expert. LinkedIn, I can be found with my name, Thomas Wilson. Also, if you search there for Fish Nutrition Expert, I think I have it attached in my name. It'll show up. Apple Podcasts, I'm not doing yet, but I want to do it soon. So please remember to subscribe to any of those to follow my notifications. Like my videos, comment on my videos, tell me what you'd like to see instead. Turn on your notifications so you find out when I release new material. And please share my material, particularly if you are a student, you share with your other students. So thank you very much, and until next time.